About as early as I can remember. I have to back up and start with my father. He was born in 1900. He never finished high school. He went to work for a public utility as a technician. And he was smart, and he got promoted eventually to a job in which he had reasonable responsibilities, working for engineers. And I don't know whether it was his involvement with electricity that got me started or something in myself, but I can remember as early as first and second grade making things electrical, like electromagnets, winding copper wire on a nail and being able to turn it on and off. And that just continued through, as I say, as far back as I can remember. I was involved in making gadgets around the house. If anything could be taken apart that was electric, from clocks to radios or whatever. By the time I was 10, I was doing radio repair for the neighbors, vacuum tube radios at that point, of course. As soon as the war ended, I got myself licensed as an amateur radio operator and built all my equipment. So it goes way back. Yes, I mean, we made things together.
Sure.
I did a lot all by myself, but we made things. We made a large electromagnet that could be operated by plugging it into the line. By large, I mean it had a 4-inch by 4-inch steel core, laminated core about a foot long, and a ton of wire on it. And with this, you could levitate things through electromagnetic induction, and you could show the way induced currents produced heat. We also made a Tesla coil with vacuum tubes, which produced probably 20 or 30 kilovolts, and you could do interesting things with that high voltage, essentially static electricity. Right. Create a Jacob's ladder, if you know what that is.
Sure.
She thought this was okay. I also messed around with chemistry in the basement, and occasionally it would make a big stink, and that was not so okay.
Right.
But the electrical stuff was quiet and not smelly, for the most part. Well, it was somewhere around 10 years of age, because I was then building radios with vacuum tubes, receivers. The war was on and I couldn't use a transmitter, but I was building receivers from scratch with vacuum tubes. Started out with the crystal radio, as everybody did in those days, but quickly switched over to a regenerative receiver with an audio amplifier and a loudspeaker. Well, that was a very powerful idea. I mean, it was, I was about to say it was my first experience with what the English would call a valve, a way of controlling electricity, the flow of electricity, but actually earlier experiences. I mean, a switch is a valve, if you will. It's a bipolar valve. But the idea of a vacuum tube where you control the plate current with the grid voltage was very powerful. And I didn't understand it in the level of detail that I came to understand it when I arrived here through my electrical engineering studies. But I understood that by making the grid negative, you repel the electrons from the cathode, and they didn't make it to the plate. But the whole idea of space charge and how you control space charge was beyond me at that point. I think my introduction to it was with a simpler tube, namely a rectifier, a 2-element tube, a cathode and a plate. Because the first thing I built, knowing I was going to be building a radio, was a power supply, a 250-volt DC power supply. And again, it's easier there because when the polarity of the AC is negative with respect to the cathode, it repels the electrons, and when it's positive, it collects them. And so it's an easy concept to get. And then you put the grid in.
Turns AC to DC, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And when you put the grid in, you have a more delicate and a more powerful control mechanism, one that doesn't expend power, or not very much power. I was thinking at that point exclusively of engineering. I wanted to understand more about the way things worked. I wanted to make things.
What kind of things?
Anything that had electricity involved with it. Most anything. This before the semiconductors, of course, so it was all thought of in terms of what you could do with vacuum tubes. But I entered high school with the conviction I was going to study engineering. As the years went through, I went through high school, those 4 years. My town didn't have a high school in those days. I was bused to a neighboring town. A class of about 250, of which maybe 30 of us were from the town I lived in. And in my senior year, I applied to MIT, which my father's supervisors had said, this is the place you want to study engineering, and to Yale, which then had the Sheffield School of Engineering. and to RPI. Was admitted to all three, but MIT was the only one that didn't offer me any money. The other two made it quite easy to go. And I was about to go to Yale, which had offered the most, when I had a conversation with really my first mentor, besides my family, and that was my English teacher in high school. Had her for 4 years. Emily Morford, M-O-R-F-O-R-D. And I told her, she knew where I'd applied. She wrote a reference for me, and I told her what my tentative decision was, and she took me to the woodshed and said, you can't do that. If you have a chance to go to MIT, that's where you should go. It's the best place to study engineering. I've always enjoyed writing and do a lot of it. And maybe that's part of it, because she taught writing. She taught the English language the way it should have been taught. You know, we diagrammed sentences, we worked on paragraph structure, and the whole 9 yards. And I came out of high school, I think, being a pretty good writer. And it paid off in later years here. Still pays off. Too many of them can't really create a sensible sentence, let alone a paragraph. It's astonishing to me. I mean, they come through, MIT students come here with an average verbal score of something like 750. But still, most of them are abominable writers. Not all. I mean, some are very skillful. Some have learned the craft. But a great many of them come here needing a boost in their writing, which they get. Mm-hmm. At that time, MIT had a wholly scripted freshman year. No choice. You took 5 subjects, same 5 subjects. If you were American and male, you took ROTC. It was required for 2 years. And the whole freshman class had one advisor. It was a dean, Dean Petrie. And sometime in the summer, you got a letter from the dean saying you were assigned to section 37, and you attended all your classes with that same section, which had a real value, by the way. You got to know 30 students pretty well. That doesn't happen anymore with the great variation in the freshman year. Freshman year went well. I loved it. I was invited in the second semester to be in a special section of second semester math, which would be more theoretical in nature. And I did that for about a month and said, no, this is not for me. I'm interested in the applications of mathematics and not so much in the theory. And so I switched back to the normal, what was then called M12, second semester math. But the undergraduate experience for me was fine. I enjoyed it. I could hardly wait to come back. And I did pretty well at it. During the summer, in those days, freshmen got visited by fraternity students, because when you arrived here, you had to make a choice between whether you were going to live in a dormitory or live in a fraternity, pledge a fraternity. And I had a visit that summer from 2 students, both of them living in New Jersey. And I said, no, I'm not going to Rush Week. I'm going to live in the dormitory. I already had an assignment in East Campus, which was then all single rooms. And I lived there about through Thanksgiving, but found it was intensely lonely, partly because all the folks around me in that dormitory were GIs who'd come back from World War II. You know, the largest class ever to graduate from MIT was a class of 1950, because it swept off all the guys who'd had their education interrupted in the early 40s. And the GIs who returned were very single-minded about their studies. They were not involved in any social life or other activity that 18-year-olds would be involved in. And I just felt isolated. So as happened, the 2 students who had visited me in the summer showed up again one evening and visited me at the dormitory and said, why don't you come over and have dinner? Well, I did. And that opened my eyes to a very different style of living at MIT, to live with 28 other people in a 4-story house on Commonwealth Avenue. And so I moved into the house in December and lived there for the next 3+ years, 3.5+ years. And that was also an important learning and living experience for me, because I was an only child. I had only 2 cousins. one on each side of the family, saw them seldom, and really had grown up had neighborhood friends to be sure, but their interests were different from mine. Had never had an association with other people my age whose interests overlapped with mine. And I had a role there eventually in governance of the place, as most people did, and it was a great experience. He was talking, I think, about the fact that there were 3, perhaps 4 members of my class who had been major donors to MIT. Major donors on the scale of tens of millions of dollars. It was
Done good.
Done good.
Done good.
And they were partly connected to that, but they were all members of the corporation as well. When I retired from the corporation just a year ago at this meeting, the meeting this Friday, there were 2 other members who were retiring, not at the same meeting, but who retired at the June meeting. So 3 of us, members of my class, who'd been corporation life members of the corporation, all retired last year, and the other 2 were both in that category of more than $10 million donors, steady, really important support to MIT. And I think when Chuck was saying this is the illustrious class of 1954, he had in mind that there were some heavy hitters in it. Mm-hmm. I, at that point, had been dating a young woman from Wheaton College for 3 years. We intended to marry. She was a year behind me. She was class of '55. So I asked the Army for a 1-year leave during which I was going to pursue a master's degree, also in electrical engineering. And in those days it was possible. I had an NSF fellowship for that year, and it was possible by working at it full time to do it in a year. So in 1955, a year later, I got my master's degree. She got her bachelor's degree and graduated. The week after that, we were married. And had a summer job in Princeton, New Jersey, with the RCA laboratories, which I had intended to be a full-time job. I have to tell you, when I left MIT in June of 1955, I told everybody who would listen that I'm never going to set foot in this place again, because I'd had it right up to the nose. 5 years of full-time, fairly high-pressure education had left me worn out. And I said, I'm going away. I'm going to be a captain of industry. I went to RCA. I'd had offers from RCA and IBM and Bell Labs. I picked RCA. Worked for them from the end of June through the end of August. Took a military leave and went in the Army for 2 years. As luck would have it, I ended up spending the entire 2 years at Fort Devens, 40 miles from here in Massachusetts. My Army service branch was the Army Security Agency, which at that time was the predecessor of what's now called the National Security Agency. Its business was listening in on what the other guy was saying, seeing what you could figure out. And I was trained as a traffic analyst. But when I finished my training at Fort Devens, which was about 5 months, they said, Gray, we want you to stay here, not take a field assignment in your specialty, but stay here and teach GIs how to operate and maintain this fairly sophisticated electronic equipment.
Listening devices.
Listening devices, yeah. Which we did. We stayed right at Fort Devens for the whole 2 years. And that experience of teaching, which was really my first shot at teaching. I'd run some tutoring sessions in a fraternity for freshmen and things like that, but never before taught an organized subject. That left me convinced that I enjoyed teaching a lot, and secondly, that I needed more knowledge, more understanding. So my second mentor in life was a man named Thomas F. Jones. During my undergraduate years, he was an associate professor in EE. During my graduate years, 3 years, 1957 and 1960, he left MIT to become head of the Department of Electrical Engineering at Purdue, and tried very hard to recruit me to Purdue when I finished. A few years later, he was dean at Purdue, and by 1975, he was president of the University of South Carolina. But he was my second mentor in life. I worked for him as a student assistant all 3 years, sophomore, junior, and senior year, calibrating instruments for the laboratory. And I I looked up to him as someone with a career and a style that I wanted to emulate. So that's more than you ask, but that's how I got back here. He had pushed me very hard when I graduated with the master's degree to accept the teaching assistantship and take a military leave. He said, if you do that and you come back, you'll have 2 years seniority, and you can start right in then. And I said, nope, I'm not going to do that. I've had enough of higher education. He kind of smiled at that. 18 months, I came back to see him. 18 months later, 6 months away from my discharge from the Army, I came back and said, can I get readmitted? And could I get an appointment? Which is what happened. No, there was nothing attached to the Cold War or to national security at all. When I came back, I was appointed instructor, sort of one notch above teaching assistant. And so I taught every semester, and started out my teaching doing a section alongside Harold Ledgert and Dr. Papa Flash. And as I got involved in teaching, I found it enormously satisfying, demanding, but very satisfying. And somewhere in that 2-year interval with teaching every semester, I came to the conclusion, this is what I wanted to do with my life. Sometime during that 3-year interval, when I was back here as a graduate student, teaching every semester, and finding challenge and great satisfaction in that experience, it came clear to me that this is what I wanted to do with my life. So I was fortunate at that point because MIT was in the process of greatly expanding the graduate program. That expansion was enabled by the changes that occurred in the wake of the Sputnik episode. Well, I was in graduate school that October, the first October back here, and suddenly this happened, and all of a sudden there was I wouldn't say panic, but there was great concern that, oh my goodness, the Russians are way ahead of us in science and technology. They can put a satellite up. I'm not sure. I don't know. That doesn't stick to me. There are a few events in life, like the Kennedy assassination, where I could tell you exactly where I was, but Sputnik didn't come to that level. And part of the process of selecting a research area for any graduate student is to find somebody who's got support, who can support me part-time and carry me through the research. And at that time, a large degree of interest in the government and elsewhere was being expressed in what were called the thermoelectric materials. Materials that were thermoelectric at higher temperatures than previous thermoelectric materials. Compound semiconductors, which could be thermoelectric and produce temperature differences of 50 or 60 degrees centigrade, imagining their possible use in refrigerators or things like that. And one of the faculty in whose area my office was had a extended contract for work in that area, and was looking for graduate students to work on it. And it was related to semiconductors, not to valves, but to a different application of semiconductors, and that's what led me into it. And indeed, that's what I did my thesis in. It was a question of finding a topic which would enable me to be supported to do it. I think it is the key element in a journey to enable one to continue educating oneself without the benefit of a teacher. And for somebody involved in either science or engineering, the fields will continue to evolve and change with new ideas coming along, so that if you don't stay up to date, if you don't educate yourself to stay up to date, you become irrelevant. An engineer who isn't involved in continuing education right away, in one form or another, will eventually become irrelevant and find it hard to find employment. So I think it's crucial, and something we may talk about later. The Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program was an effort to try and bring students to that level of understanding. The level being, how do you proceed when there's no one to ask? How do you proceed with a novel question that no one has answered? How do you get your head around that? How do you learn how to make progress? And a good UROP can produce that experience for an undergraduate. It's the kernel, of course. It's the essential part of either a master's thesis and, to a greater degree, an SCD thesis. Not a lot. Not a lot, no. He was interested in me having as much education as I could get. And so he was pleased when I came back to graduate school, I think. He was not so pleased when I decided to stay on at MIT, and I'll tell you about that later, perhaps. But no, he was not a significant influence in any way on that at that time. I was at that time, we'd been married. We were married in 1955. Yeah, 55. This was 1957 when I came back. We had one child and another on the way. Priscilla was dealing with the two daughters, soon to be two daughters, and I was eager to get on with it and get to the point where the cash flow was reversed. Because while I had some support from the Institute, I didn't have full support, and it wasn't easy to keep the family functioning on an instructorship. It was helped by the fact that my wife had worked 2 years as a school teacher while we were in the Army. 1 year as a school teacher while we were in the Army. She left then to have the baby. And that money in the bank proved invaluable. The other thing that mattered enormously to me was that Harold Edgerton, Doc Edgerton, found me a summer job at EG&G, which made all the difference.
EG&G?
Edgerton, Germershausen, and Greer, the company that he and his two partners founded. It was a company that was founded to do the instrumentation for the atomic weapons testing, and then it branched out into other high-speed measurement technology.
Wow.
Well, things got more comfortable when I got the PhD and could then was appointed assistant professor. I said before that I was very fortunate in the timing of things. The Ford Foundation had in 1959 made a $10 million grant to MIT. That was really big money in 1959. To the School of Engineering. And the dean then, Gordon Brown, used $4 million of that money to create 4 professorships, the Ford Engineering chairs. And a great deal more of the money went into what were called Ford postdoctoral fellowships. So you got appointed assistant professor. You were on a Ford postdoctoral fellowship for 3 years, I think, which gave you more freedom of action than if you were out scrambling for research dollars to start your own research program at that point. In fact, I did not start a research program up at that point. I'd finished the work on thermoelectrics. And by 1960, there were 3 other colleagues in the Department of Electrical Engineering, Richard Adler, Dick Thornton, and Campbell Searle, who were just beginning to put together the idea for a revolution in the teaching of electronics, to put the vacuum tube aside and base the entire structure of the curriculum on semiconductor electronics. And I got involved in that with them right away and started writing materials. We eventually wrote 7 textbooks. We produced 2 educational films, and we produced a whole range of laboratory experiments on semiconductors that people could easily do, including making a simple grown junction transistor. This was before monolithic technology and silicon transistors. It was all in germanium. And we got a major grant, a long-term grant from the National Science Foundation to support this activity. And I named these 4 people who were here, but we also brought in people from industry, and we brought in people from other universities to work on this. So this was a large-scale undertaking. It involved Stanford and Berkeley. It involved IBM and Raytheon. There were many partners in this, and it went from 1960 to about 1966 66 or 67.
And the mission was really to address an issue that educational methods for electrical engineering in the United States were possibly antiquated, that there was a need for many, many more engineers given the
Right.
security and technological requirements, and you were right at the head of all of that.
Right. This was what had happened up to that time is the curriculum in electrical engineering here and elsewhere had been tinkered with to bring in semiconductors. But what it needed was to say, we're done with vacuum tubes for all practical purposes, except for some high power applications. And people who need to learn that can learn it. But semiconductors are going to be at the heart of everything we do. By that time, the monolithic silicon device had been invented. Integrated circuits were being made. The integrated circuit inventions, the patents were 1959. And it was clear, we thought it was astonishing when we saw, we had held in our hands integrated circuits with 30,000 components. And now we're working up towards 1 billion components. Integrated circuits had just come into being. And an MIT alumnus named Bob Noyce, who was one of the two inventors of the integrated circuit, had set up a company in California to make these things. And he came back and gave a series of seminars. And he showed us chips which had on them 30 or 40,000 components, which at the time seemed almost unbelievable. Now, of course, commonplace, millions of transistors, 100 million on a chip, and we soon will see 1 billion on a chip. There are probably structures of that density now available on a test basis. So it was clear that things were changing very rapidly, and what needed to be done was to toss out the old curriculum in electronics and start from scratch with the physics of semiconductors, with the physical electronics of semiconductor devices, with their modeling, and then with their circuit applications. And the 7 books that we prepared in a series called the Semiconductor Electronics Education Committee, the SEC series, they were slim books, a couple hundred pages, on different topics. But it started with physics, and it ended up with design. And I wrote a separate volume by myself, kind of as an introduction to the first volume, called Introduction to Semiconductor Electronics, which was not an SEC undertaking, but one that I undertook myself, because we needed something in front of that first book for somebody who hadn't studied any electronics at all. And that was a great experience. It was an opportunity. I had not only the opportunity to participate in the writing of these materials, but I taught them all, along with the other folks, and we all taught it. And it was being taught elsewhere. And it revolutionized the teaching of electronics across the United States over a period of 5 to 10 years. And it's still doing that in other places in the world.
It also made MIT the place to come to jump onto a fast track towards cutting edge research into semiconductor design and
Yes, it did.
computer engineering and all that.
It did. And MIT...
Did you understand how huge that was at the time?
I don't think so, no. I understand in hindsight, though, that we made a mistake. The question arose around 1970, 10 years after this exciting decade of the 60s. Should MIT create a full-scale facility in the fabrication of monolithic semiconductor devices, a fab lab? And the decision was reached in a department, no, we shouldn't, because the technology is changing so rapidly that it will be very difficult to keep it up to speed, to keep it up to the frontier. And we have to rely on partnerships in industry to do the fabrication for us. Berkeley and Stanford took a different track. They each created those facilities. And that's why Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. I mean, we missed a beat there. I wasn't involved in the conversation at the time. I was doing other things. But it was a discussion that was carried on earnestly and thought that would come to the right conclusion. But with the benefit of hindsight, it was a mistake. We missed the beat.
Interesting.
Might have had 128 version of Silicon Valley instead.
Well, you may yet.
You have to understand that all of those jobs up to Dean of Engineering were part-time. People ask me, how do you get to be president at MIT? And I say, well, it happened accidentally. And there's a good deal of truth in that. The first job I took on, 1962, I was advising freshmen. All new faculty advised freshmen. And so in 1960, I had 20 freshman advisees. And there was something called the Freshman Advisory Council, which was the group of advisors who met a couple times a year, typically before the term started, to talk about things that were of issue. And I went to a couple of those meetings, and the person who was then Dean of Students, a man named Kenneth Wadley, said, the present chairman, who was a mechanical engineer, has served his term. Would you serve as chair? I said, sure, I'll do that. It wasn't a big deal. So I became chair of the Freshman Advisory Council. And in 1965, 3 years later, a committee which was chaired by Gerald Zacharias, who was the great physics curriculum innovator of the 1950s and early 60s, chaired a commission which recommended major changes in the undergraduate curriculum starting with the freshman year to begin in 1966, fall of 66. At that point, Ken Wadley said, I need somebody to help manage this transition. Will you become Associate Dean of Students half-time? I said, okay, I'll do that. I was still professor. I had graduate students working generally in the area of high-temperature superconductivity, which was the hot topic of that time. Turned out 4 or 5 PhDs in that area in the 60s, and a lot of master students. So I said I would do that. And I worked at that for 3 years, I guess, till 1968. At that point, Jerry Wiesner, who was provost, Howard Johnson was president, Jerry was provost. Jerry asked me to come to work in the provost office as associate provost, with the same responsibilities, only broadened out to look at undergraduate education beyond the freshman year as well. I stayed in that position until the fall of 1970, when the then Dean of Engineering resigned suddenly to go off and head the National Science Foundation. And Howard and Jerry, desperate to have somebody to manage the dean's office, asked me if I'd serve as dean. And that was the first full-time job. That was the point at which I had to stop fooling myself, that I was still a professor and part-time administrator, because suddenly it was learning a new job in very much a full-time capacity. And then 7 months later, Jerry was elected president, and the corporation asked me to serve as his deputy as chancellor. So that's how that evolved. And I explain that to people and say, this is what I mean by being accidental. A whole set of positions which I earnestly took, thinking these would be short-term, half-time assignments, and I'm going to be really a professor here. By that time, I had the class of 1922 chair, which was given by the class. I was a second holder of it. The first holder retired. Was given to someone who had shown exceptional ability in teaching. I was very pleased with that. I had to give it up when I became chancellor. Had to retire as a faculty member. Suddenly I was a full-time administrator. Jerry and I had to retire. In those days, the rules required that you couldn't be a professor and a corporation member at the same time. So we retired. He gave up his institute professorship. I gave up the chair, and we were full-time administrators. Well, of those part-time jobs, the favorite was working for Jerry as associate provost. Edwin Land, Din Land, had in 1968, the year I went to work for Jerry, had created a charitable lead trust, which was going to provide MIT with $500,000 a year for 5 years to be expended on undergraduate education. And so almost the first thing out of the box when I went to work for Jerry in the fall of 68, I should say, I had my one sabbatical from February of 68 to September of 68. When I came back from sabbatical, we went right to work on how we're going to spend this money. And that's a longish story. But also, April of 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. June of 68, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. The small number, 30 perhaps, African-American students at MIT created the Black Students Union at MIT. And in September, presented Howard Johnson with a list, not of demands, but a list of requests of things to do to increase the presence of African-Americans at MIT. That's another long story, which we should talk about. But those were the two things that I got to work on through 1968 and into 1969. Part of that money, big chunk of that money was expended in the effort to start Europe, and that also is a longer story we should talk about. Other monies were spent on creating experimental programs, 2 of which still exist. And having that opportunity to have real money at your disposal to spend in trying to improve undergraduate education was very exciting. And having a set of folks which were Jerry, Walter Rosenblith, Associate Provost, Gerald Zacharias, who I mentioned earlier, is always full of ideas, and Benson Snyder. Those 4 people, plus me, created a group that met every week to talk about what we were going to do for undergraduate education, and it was a tremendously exciting time. It was also exciting on a front of increasing African American presence here. The movement toward greater diversity started around 1960, and I was not involved in it at that point at all. Prior to 1960, there were fewer than 20 women in every class, classes of 900 to 1,000. And the number of women in the class was determined by the capacity of a boarding house with a house mother on Bay State Road. Many more women applied to MIT. There had always been women at MIT back to 1866, but few. There were more around World War I than there were in 1955, for reasons that I don't understand. But the fact that it was limited to 20 out of a much larger pool meant that the women that we were admitting were really very well qualified. And there was an urge to be able to admit more. Along about that time, 1961 or so, Mrs. McCormick, who was the heir to the McCormick Reaper family fortune, her husband Stanley had been institutionalized most of his life and had died long before. She gave money to build a dormitory for women, the first tower McCormick Hall, and eventually she doubled it, and it became twice the size. That enabled the percentage of women to increase by 1970 to about 10%. Almost 100 in a class. And then the change beyond that for women, and the change for underrepresented minorities beyond women, began to really come to fruition around 1968, 69. When I came back from sabbatical leave in the fall, and Howard had this list of requests on his desk from the Black Students Union, and he said, let's figure out how we're going to deal with this, and asked me to bring a group of students and faculty and staff together. We call it the Task Force on Educational Opportunity, to work through that. There was a stab at this a year earlier when the admissions office, at the urging of the faculty committee, admitted twice as many African Americans. That meant we had 12 in a class instead of 6. There were more African students and black Africans in the class than there were African Americans. And that was the first change, but it was an incremental change. It was a doubling, but nonetheless incremental. What needed to be done, and what didn't get done until 1968, 69, was high-level recruiting. You had to broaden the pool, which is what we finally did. And the class that entered in 1968 had 47 African American kids in it. And it's grown some since then, grown considerably since then. That's something we might talk about, how that came about and what was necessary to make it happen.
Well, how did it come about?
Okay. The task force, the students brought their request to the task force, and they involved recruiting. They involved greater financial support. They involved a tutoring program, a summer leg up kind of program. All these were ideas that they laid out. We started that fall. We hired a fellow named John Mims, who was African American, to come in and be an assistant director of admissions to help us on a recruiting front. We sent a lot of present MIT students, not very many of them. There were about 30 in the BSU. we sent as many of them who had time and would go out to recruit in predominantly black schools in the major cities. We asked the college board to give us the addresses of students who had above some threshold score on the SATs and on the achievement tests, and who were African American, who had recorded themselves as African American. They give us those addresses, and we did mailings to all of them. We created a summer program called Project Interphase, which still operates, that ran for 8 weeks and was staffed largely by African American students, graduate students, and was overseen by a young man named James Bishop, who had just got his PhD in chemistry here and was very interested in this issue and supervised that. All of these activities were started by the task force, and that enabled us to get the numbers up. It was a bit like, how to describe it? I mean, we were admitting students whose qualifications look very different than the traditional admits. And so the task is to figure out whom we should admit so that we don't put a significant number of people at risk in terms of their career. You don't want to admit students here who are going to grind and grind and grind and go away disillusioned. So it's a moving target. We changed the standards year after year. We tinkered with them for the next 5 years, trying to get it right. And I think we did probably bring that first year some students for whom it was not the right thing, and some of them left. But we also brought some students who in the past would never have been admitted. So that's how it came about initially. I was involved in that up to about 1975 as chancellor. Well, I don't know what it would focus on today if it exists. I just don't know. But there was some of that at the time. Now, in the spring of 1968, in April of 1968, when we were well embarked on this, we'd admitted the first class. We went to the faculty because we needed approvals of some things. We needed approvals for this summer subjects. We taught get up to speed subjects in physics and math. There was a humanities program, there was an athletics and social program, and we needed to have that blessed by the faculty. And we reported at that meeting on what we had done in terms of admissions and why we had done it and what the class was coming in looked like. And we got approval for the things we needed approval for. And that was perhaps the most, at that time, April of '68, was probably the most intensely emotional faculty meeting I'd ever been to. And that was 8 years of faculty meetings at that point. And a couple of people came up to me afterwards and said, I had tears in my eyes when you made this presentation. I didn't make it all. Black students made it. Graduate students made it. Made a large part of it. And it overwhelmingly accepted. But there were certainly people, some of them came to me later and said, what are you doing? What are you doing to these kids? Is this a good thing? What are you doing to the quality of the MIT student body?
How did the sort of culture and, I don't know, the sort of intangible qualities of the student body change during this period?
Well, remember now it's changing in 2 dimensions. There are
Right.
more women coming,
Right.
and there are large numbers of students who weren't seen here before. One of the early happenings was the creation of what's now called Chocolate City. We have one dormitory here called Newhouse, which has 6 entries. It was designed on a model in which each entry would house about 50 people, and it would be a more cohesive living group than if you had 300 people in one undifferentiated building. 6 separate entries, each with kitchens on every floor and so on. Chocolate City emerged, just not because anybody said we needed it, just happened. People gravitated. And admitted students gravitated to congregate with other African American kids. And Chocolate City, over a period of a few years, came about. That's what they call themselves. Yeah, that's the name. And that's how they recruit every year for student members, new students coming in, entering students. Well, it was a new experience for me. I mean, I had not ever had an African American in my classes through high school. And there were 15 or 16 in my freshman class at MIT, and I didn't know a single one of them. Never had them in class. Didn't have a woman in my class at MIT until my junior year. So those were new experiences for me. I should say we did a lot. We also created some new subjects on the African American experience and had them team taught sometime by inside people and sometime by people we brought in from the outside. I mean, a lot of things were happening in the 60s, of course. The revolution came to Berkeley before it came east. But eventually, beginning in fact in 1968 and coming to a crescendo in 1970 or 71, there was a good deal of anti-war activism here, which really dominated for a couple of years the activities and the focus of the leadership of the institution to keep it from flying apart. It wasn't as serious here as it was at Harvard. But being located in a major metropolitan area with a higher density of colleges and universities than any other place in the country, when there was some function at MIT in the form of protest, people showed up from all over Greater Boston. And it got to be fairly intensive in terms of trying to keep the school working and keep the peace. I have to back up to 1957. MIT in the 50s had what was called the Arthur DeHaan Little Memorial Lecture Series. Arthur D. Little was an alumnus. And it was a lecture delivered every year by some prominent person. In 1957, Edwin Land delivered a lecture which he titled The Generation of Greatness. And in it, he made the argument that colleges and universities, particularly those with a focus on science and engineering, fields of science and engineering, tend to drive the creativity out of 18-year-olds. That they come off to college all fired up, full of ideas, enthusiastic about getting on with things, and then they're faced with the requirements, the curriculum. And in his view, it drives out the creativity. And he said, what you ought to have instead is every student who comes in ought to have someone he called, I think, a guide, a mentor, a faculty member, who would take that student in hand, learn about what his interests, his or her interests are, what she or he wants to study, lay out a program, stay in touch with that student throughout, and guide him through the 4 years. I'm not sure he called it a guide, but he had a word for it. 1957. In 1968, when we suddenly had a large chunk of money and 5 years worth of it coming, $2.5 million in all from Din Land, everybody, this group I described, the 5 of us who met, said we ought to go back and look at the ADL lecture and see if we can in some way push in that direction. And out of that came the thought that we should, because the place has a very rich research environment, with all faculty involved in research and with many faculty involved in overlapping areas, it's a rich environment. We ought to be able to find a way in which interested students could pair up with a faculty member and work on a real project, not a cooked project, but something real, something that would be useful to the faculty member, and learn how to proceed when you don't understand how to answer the questions. That key step in education. In the winter of 1968-69, I recruited a young woman who was an MIT graduate, had a PhD in physics, PhD in material science, in material science. Her name was Margaret McVicker. She died in 2002 of lung cancer. Never smoked in her life, but had somehow lived 1 year after diagnosis. And I said to her, there's this idea we'd like to try. Would you want to work on it? I learned about her from Gerald Zacharias, who had known her as an undergraduate. And he said, this is the kind of person who has the drive and the personality who could make this work. At that point, she was an instructor in the physics department, not an assistant professor, an instructor. She became assistant professor the next year. And we laid out what the idea was, and she said, I want to work on this. I'll work on it full time, starting in the summer of 1969 now, 69. And she made it happen. All I did was run interference for her with department heads. Because we said early on, you got to talk to key department heads, because this can't come as a surprise to them that their faculty are saying, hey, I've got this undergraduate working with me on something called UROP. That was her invention, that name. So as she went around to talk to department heads, many of them, including my own department head, electrical engineering, computer science, pushed back and said, that's never going to work. It's going to be just one more burden on the faculty, one more thing they have to do, and it won't work. Well, I tried to run a little defense on that and say, give it a chance, and we'll see what happens.
What was your argument?
Well, my argument was that this was worth trying, and we had the money to try it, and we ought to give it a good shot and see if it'll work. And if it turns out to be something the faculty can't stand, we'll stop it.
And the potential upside was what in your
Potential upside was that this would be a way in which students could, for the first time perhaps in their years at MIT, come to terms with an unsolved real problem, something where they could make a genuine contribution. Exciting prospect. And it started that fall with a little thin booklet of opportunities. She talked with enough faculty to have a range of things one could do, and it was sent to freshmen, or given to freshmen at orientation. And I don't know how many signed up that first year, but there were 50 or 100, something in that range perhaps. And it just grew like Topsy from then on.
And this wasn't just bottle washing and
Oh,
Xeroxing?
No, there was one rule. The only rule was that what you do has got to be worth academic credit, and it has to be signed off on by a faculty member. That was it. This was a non-bureaucratic deal. There was no committee formed to figure out how to do it. It was just one person who was making it happen, and it was as unbureaucratic as it was possible to make it. You can do anything you want to do as long as you find a faculty member who's willing to say, yes, I will supervise this, and if done properly, is worth academic credit. Now, students had a choice. They could do it for academic credit, or they could do it for pay. And you know, at that point, all students here had self-help requirements, and many of them would do it for pay because they wanted to not borrow the money instead. But in either case, the sign-off had to be that it was credit-worthy. So it was not washing bottles, no. Now some 80% of the undergraduates do UROP while they're here, and the number doing it any particular term is about half the undergraduate body. And many of the alumni will tell you this was the most important thing they did at MIT. It's what they remember the most, and what meant the greatest, was the biggest deal to them in terms of their education. So the program took off. It's never been bureaucratic. If the program office disappeared tomorrow, the program would still continue because the faculty appreciate it. Young faculty particularly thought this was a grand thing because it gave them smart hands to work with them at much less cost than a postdoc, or much less cost than a graduate student who had to be supported. The young faculty thought it was a grand thing, and other faculty have piled in as well.
Has the program been replicated outside of MIT?
There were intensive efforts to replicate it. Once this got going, not in 1969, but by the early 70s, it was being written up in the Chronicle, and there were pieces in the general press about it. And a lot of folks came calling, saying, help us make this go. The key thing that it takes, I'll say two things that it takes. One is you have to have a rich research environment. You have to have lots of research activity. You can't do it if research is on a small scale, because there aren't enough people to match students up with. So you have to have a research environment that's broad, covers a wide range of subjects, and is rich. And secondly, you have to have the genius that Margaret McVicker brought to make it non-bureaucratic. Stanford came and said, we watch this, we see how it works, and we're going to start it. The first thing they did was appoint a committee. Committees kill things. They make them too, you know, they write the rules. And you only need that one rule. Faculty members got to approve it. Some places have, there are programs like it, but none quite on the scale that it is here, which I attribute entirely to her genius.
But nevertheless, it's also something that you have a certain amount of personal pride
Yeah,
over.
yeah. I mean, I was her supporter in this, but she did all the hard work. She deserves the credit for it. I was delighted to have it happen, and I think Dinland was delighted to have it happen. If you look at the history of research support at MIT, there was very little. Prior to World War II, it was almost non-existent. Occasional faculty members would have a grant from a company, from industry, to support a graduate student. We had graduate students through the doctorate in those years, but there were very few. And it was the World War II experience, which we should talk about at some point, the influence of the radiation laboratory, that left the government understanding that if we supported research and graduate education in universities, it would have benefits for the nation. It all came out of that report that Vannevar Bush wrote called Science, the Endless Frontier, when he said if we continue this partnership between government providing research dollars to universities, it would have benefits to the economy, to public health, and to the general welfare, to job creation.
And the template for that partnership really came out of the radiation labs.
It did. It did. Well, no, it was broader than that. It was broader than that, John. I mean, the template for this continuation of research support grew out of all these laboratories that had been created around the country during the war. It was a RAD lab here. It was the Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech. It was the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, and how many others I don't remember. That was the template for the continued research support. If you look at a graph of research support, it starts out in the late 40s, and it increases continuously, and then there's a big increase in the slope. On the semi-log coordinates, there's a big increase in the slope in 1958 because of Sputnik, and it continues right up to 1968. And in 1968, Lyndon Johnson realized he couldn't have simultaneously the war on poverty and the war in Vietnam. And research support began to be cut back. It fell in real terms until the start of the Carter administration in, what was that, 76. It came up a bit in 76, and then was largely stagnant in real terms through the 80s. Didn't get another boost until really into the 90s. Its effect on MIT was not as great as it may have been on other institutions. We were more or less flat in constant dollars. We were not at that point increasing the graduate population, didn't have the capacity to increase it because of the funding constraints. But there still was a very rich research program going on here. What has happened, if you look at the larger picture, what has happened from World War II up to the present, is that much of the research support in the post-war era came from the Department of Defense. It was what in the jargon of the Defense Department was called 6.1 funds, that is basic research. It was not targeted research. It was not related very directly to applications at all. It was quite fundamental. They created the Material Science Laboratory here with Department of Defense support. But as time went on, the NSF became more prominent. The National Institutes of Health, which is now the single largest source of research money here, became much more prominent. And the Department of Defense funding decreased. I think starting really in the Reagan years, when he was determined to build up our defense posture and was taking money out of the 6.1 category and putting it into higher levels of research, development, test, and production. So the Department of Defense support dropped. The other two increased greatly. The problem with the NIH support is that every congressman's got his favorite disease, and a lot of that money gets earmarked, not always in ways that are fully constructive. By and large, pretty good, but there are also some problems. And we've had to adapt, of course, to that shift. The research support was critical at the end of my time as president, when Chuck Vest became president. You may remember there was the great overhead scandal, which started at Stanford that year, where there was the expense of a yacht was being paid out of research overhead. satin sheets in the president's house, a wedding party in the president's house, partially paid out of overhead. And the Congress really came down very hard on overhead, reimbursement of overhead costs. The circular 821, which describes all the rules, got revised, substantially revised. We took a big hit. All universities took a big hit. Expenses that used to be reimbursable no longer were. And we had to adapt to that. Chuck Vest, my successor as president, spent the better part of his first few years as president in Washington trying to persuade the Congress, not that MIT needed more support, but that research universities were important, that graduate education was important, and the government had an ongoing stake in this, which if it did not fill, was not going to get filled by anybody else. And he largely turned that around and was widely recognized for that. I think that's why he got the National Medal of Science. Following Sputnik, somewhere in that interval up to, say, the 1980s, there had been a number of happenings that led us to develop, led the nation to develop a more modest appraisal of Soviet science and engineering. I remember one of the crucial elements was a Russian pilot flew out of the country with a MiG, the most advanced MiG they were making at that point, and landed it somewhere in the Far East, and the U.S. got their hands on it. And the electronics in the MiG were still vacuum tubes, Sputnik notwithstanding. And there were a number of events of that kind which suggested that they were not as far advanced as Sputnik would have suggested. But certainly by 1980, everybody was talking about the Rust Belt. Japan was going to have not only our lunch, but breakfast and dinner too. Detroit was going to disappear from the scene, on and on and on. That led us to create the Commission on Industrial Productivity in 1985. And I have to say that among the people who were pushing us on that were some of the trustees, specifically two of the trustees who served on the executive committee, both of whom had careers in industry and understood the threat. The Commission on Industrial Productivity included engineers, physical scientists, several economists, a couple of humanists, political scientists. It was about 15 people. It was chaired by Bob Solow, Nobel laureate in economics, and Mike Dertouzis, now deceased, but the former head of the Computer Science Laboratory. And they worked at this for 2 years with support from the Sloan Foundation. And in 1986, 87, produced the report called Made in America, which had a whole set of analysis of what was wrong with manufacturing in the United States, and what ought to be done to change it. And those recommendations went from the way managers of manufacturing are trained, to the way in which designers and manufacturers don't work hand in hand, throw the design over the transom and see if they can make it, to how we educate managers generally, to how we deal with labor unions, and how do we develop a more collaborative relationship between labor unions and management. And that report had, I think, considerable impact. It was widely picked up. The Japanese eventually approved one called Made in Japan as kind of a commentary on it. It led also to our creation in 1987 of the program called Leaders for Manufacturing, which was a singular event and terribly important at MIT. It was the first time that the engineers, School of Engineering, the School of Management, and industry came together in a troika to build a new curriculum and say, this is how manufacturing, this is how the management of manufacturing should be taught. We raised $40 million from 5 companies to fund that program, the first 5 years of it. And other companies came in at smaller levels, smaller than $8 million each. But the program has been an enormous success. It's provoked imitators. It's spun off other activities at Sloan that are of a similar character. And I don't think either the book or the program can take a large share of credit for the way manufacturing in the U.S. has changed, but it certainly has changed.
You described some frustration when you placed into second semester math as an undergraduate that maybe theoretics weren't for you, that you were more interested in the applied.
Right.
In the course of your career, and particularly the years when you were president, MIT saw an extraordinary convergence of theoretical knowledge and applied knowledge and cross-disciplinary knowledge as the real sort of engines of innovation and change throughout the economy and throughout sort of technology. Describe that change as you saw it, and how important do you think it was?
Well, it came on gradually. I mean, you're right that it came on during that decade.
I mean, there were suddenly a lot of people talking to each other who didn't
Yeah.
normally, and you had
Yeah.
to be in the middle of those conversations.
We, you know, it was partly driven by funding, the flatness of federal funding during that period. We started in the 70s, and I was involved through the 80s and a little involved into the 90s, raising research support in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, and did pretty well at that. We raised a large number of chairs, and a chair funds a professor and provides some research support as well. And we raised a number of research initiation funds, which came from Japanese companies with remarkably few strings. The Koji Kobayashi, who headed Nippon Electrics, really created Nippon Electrics following World War II, gave us a couple of $1 million for a research initiation fund in the general area of electronics. And I think the funding changes, the fact that there were other relationships with industry being created. We created a partnership with IBM to support research in computer science, a long-term partnership. Turned out to be 10 years. Started in the 70s and went on into the 80s. And there were others that I'm not going to be able to put a name to right now. But the fact that funding was now coming from people who had more interest in applications, although we were very careful to make sure this funding wasn't prescriptive in the sense that it was going to constrain what we did very much. I think that was part of the force that brought together basic research and applications. That wasn't all of it, but it was part of it.
You're something of an electrical engineering rock star in Japan.